Welcome to Feminine Roadmap Podcast. I'm your host, Gina-r-Farrar. Each week, I bring you an inspiring conversation to help you navigate the challenges and changes of midlife so that you can not only survive, but thrive in your second half. Hello, Feminine Roadmappers. It is Gina here, and today we are going to be talking about transforming grief into love and grace. And my guest is Patti-Ashley. She's a psychotherapist, she's an authenticity architect, and she's the author of Letters to Freedom, From Fear to Love to Grace. Patti, thank you so much for saying yes to me.
Oh, thanks for having me, Gina. It's great to be here.
It is absolutely my pleasure. You know, it's interesting because the topic of grief has been on my mind because of what we're going through in time right now in the world with the quarantine and all of the things people have missed out on and marriage is suffering. There's just so many levels. And I had been hearing about grief as a valid emotion during this time. Most of us think of it just in terms of losing a person that we love. But we've lost so much in our lives as a whole. And so I've really been thinking about it and kind of posting about it on social media. And then I had the opportunity to say yes to your offer to be on my show, you know. And so this is one of those timely things. And I love it when this happens, where life and a topic line up beautifully. So I would really like to know, Patti, what is it that led you to this specific mission and message to talk about going from grief to grace?
Well, a lifetime of some pretty big grief, starting with losing my father when I was 11 to a sudden heart attack. And then the book happened as a memoir after I lost my fiance, the exact same way. They were both found on the living room floor of a sudden heart attack. And I had spent my life in grief, other grief of my marriage ending, custody battles, relationships not working out, broken hearts, grief, move. And I'm so glad you said that grief isn't just a person dying. Anytime there's a transition or a loss in our life, we experience what Elizabeth Kubler-Ross talked about when she talked about her stages of grief. So my life has been full of grief, and it's not easy. So I wanted to write this memoir as a way to help people move through this arduous task of grief.
The thing about grief, I think, is sometimes it's silent, right? We don't always realize because depending on what triggered it, we may not even know grief is happening. We might just feel overwhelmed or sad or lethargic, right? So let's talk a little bit about your definition of what grief looks like. We all know maybe you can go through the 5 levels, however you would want to frame grief so that people can put it into that grander context.
Well, one of the chapters in my book is called All Depression is Unresolved Grief. And that's because when I was 30 years old and I started my second degree, I have 3 degrees, but my second one was in early childhood education, and the instructor of the course, A Child in the Family, was a psychotherapist who was the daughter of the chair of the program in early childhood. And she wrote that on the board the first day of the class, that all depression is unresolved grief. And I thought, well, that's interesting, because now my father has been gone about 20 years and I hadn't really talked about my grief to anybody. And I kind of did what everybody told me, you just go on with your life because he's in heaven. And that hit me like a ton of bricks. And I thought, oh my gosh, well, that's probably why I've been depressed, a lot in my life. And so I started working with a therapist at that time. And through the years, as I got my other degree and got licensed and became a psychotherapist and started working clinically with people, I'd always start with, where's the grief? And so every time I work with a client, still, I think, where's a loss? Where has there been a loss? Because we don't give people permission to grieve losses to completion. And what we know now about the neurobiology and the nervous system is that the body holds the memory, and it's gonna sneak up on us some way, somehow, if we don't allow it to be what it is when it is. So grief is just an excruciatingly painful experience of losing something that had value to you. That's my definition. I just made it up. And, Martin Prechtel wrote a beautiful book, and he said that grief is praise. It's the things that we care about that we lose, the people that we care about that we lose. The deeper we love, the deeper the grief. And that was my big lesson, I think, in my lifetime when I started doing my unresolved grief work, is that the only way for me to step fully into the joy of this life, I have to step fully into the sorrow. Because you can't have one without the other. And I don't think that we really have this conversation much, right? I mean, how many times do we have this conversation at, the dinner table? Or not that it's necessarily a dinner table conversation, but we just, in our families, we don't, in our culture, in our work, in our society, it's really, let's get over it. Come on, move on. You know what? We always want to make people feel better. We don't realize that it's not about making people feel better. It's giving people permission to be with the sorrow to get to the other side.
And there's such a beauty to that process. It's difficult. It's not fun. But, when we hold a space for ourselves or someone else, and we, I suppose, give ourselves and others permission to feel the feelings. You talked about the way our body holds memories and emotions. I think the complication of the grief is you have the situation that's caused the grief, but then you have memories in your body that are also being triggered, possibly. So the grief is initially triggered by a loss, but how we perceive ourselves, the situation, what we did or didn't do, there's all of these gradients of emotion going on. And I think it just takes time, right? We have to allow it to take whatever time it's going to take. And I think that's what you're talking about. It's so hard for us to sit with it, isn't it?
Yeah. And I liked what you said at the beginning about the pandemic and the time that we're in right now. We're all in collective grief. And I wrote an article about this when it first happened, and all the different layers, like you're saying, of, personal grief, collective grief, grieving. We're all grieving the loss of the life we were familiar with, and all loss spirals down into all our other losses. So unfortunately, the people who have lost people from this horrible virus, that in itself is huge. And then the loss around not being able to be with our family members when they're dying these days. The loss around memorial services because we can't get together. So you could go on and on and on. There's so many losses, and I know that I recognize that when I work with my clients now, back to, all depression is unresolved grief, where's the grief? And it's so multi-layered right now with this pandemic. It's really, really challenging for everyone on many levels. I mean, even to make a decision, everyone's now in the place of making decisions about being with people because we can be with people in smaller groups. But then it's like, well, that person was traveling here, and should I be with that person? And then, but my wife's pregnant and she doesn't want my friends to come over. And then, it's not like, well, let's just go hang out and have dinner with our friends. And so there's grief even in how we make decisions, how we choose to move in our world. And so then our body has a reaction. The good news about having this conversation is when we bring it into light and we give language to it, it helps relieve some of the tension, because a lot of people don't understand what's going on, why they're feeling so agitated, or they're feeling so depressed, or they're feeling, because there are a lot of people like myself, the fortunate ones, who get to continue to work with people online. And my life is, minimally impacted compared to a lot of other people who've lost jobs. And I don't want to minimize how hard this is for me, but I'm just saying there's all different levels of complexity to the situation, and there's a lot of grief in it.
So you're saying, just now you said, I don't want to minimize my own emotion. And I want to highlight that thought that I often will say, I know that I don't have it as bad as someone else, right? Yeah. And that while that may be true, I think we still need to honor our own struggle, because it doesn't matter that someone else's is worse. This is a real situation. These are real emotions to me. And I need to allow myself to feel them and figure them out. Because like you said, it just comes back if we don't deal with it. It doesn't go away. I talked about this earlier on another episode, the spiral.
Yeah.
It comes around again. It does not go away. So I just wanted to highlight that you had made that point, that we feel the need, like we're serving other people by denying ourselves. And I don't think that that's the healthiest way to go.
I'm glad you emphasize that, and that's why I said it, because I think that a lot of times people, a lot of my clients will say, oh, it's just first world problems, and other people have it so much worse than me. And I think, my response is always, those of us with first world problems have a responsibility to really learn about our social emotional selves, because this is all brand new. It wasn't until the last century that we understood our social emotional self. It was all about physical survival, and you had to hurry up and get over it, and you had to make sure you had food and you didn't get eaten, and you stayed dry and warm if you were lucky. And so now it's like we're dry and warm, and we have modern conveniences, and we have some sort of ease in life. And we have the luxury. That's the other thing that the professor who said all depression is unresolved grief said. Now we have the luxury of looking at our emotional self. So those of us who have first world problems or don't have it as bad as other people, I think we're the ones who have the responsibility to really dig this stuff up so we can help other people that may be struggling more. And I can't emphasize that enough. So I'm really glad you circled back around to that.
I just know that I coach people as well. And you're so right. There is at the core of so many things that we fight against now, right? The things that irritate us, the things that really trip us up. You could just go back in time and you listen to the things people say, and it leads you. It's like a map to the story, to the episode, to the instance that really we are still grieving. We didn't get our needs met, or something happened. It's so interesting. So back to that multi-layered grief, I think that's what makes it so messy, because we're looking at one situation,
right? But
there's other things underneath that are happening, like an iceberg, right?
Exactly. It's exactly like an iceberg. And yeah, we're so linear. We're so left brain. We want to figure out the solution with the bullet points and the 1, 2, 3s. But our social emotional self is not a bullet point 1, 2, 3. It's flowing. It's nonlinear. It's somatic. It's sensory. And that's so brand new, hot off the press for people, and hard to get, because it seems easier if you could give me the 1, 2, 3s and the ABCs, and then I can feel safe. When the truth is, that's not where the safety lies. The safety lies in the sensory experience of paying attention, which is what I was saying earlier, why those of us who have, I wouldn't say easier, because this isn't easy for anybody, but those of us who have the ability to continue to work and continue to have, our semi-familiar lifestyles, we have the legs to kind of step into what that means to pay attention. And I've been really aware of a lot of what I've been experiencing through all this. And, I've done so much inner work, and it's still, there's always more, because they're saying we're carrying 14 generations of our ancestral trauma in our DNA. And so if you think about it, it's not just this lifetime, it's really our cells are holding the memory of a lot of trauma. And connecting the dots is what I like to do with my clients, is let's, find these stories that got made up ancestrally, and how do we change that to a better story? And it takes a lot of work. And like I said, I've been really aware of, just, it's kind of like fine tuning, like polishing a stone or something, because I know my stories. But there's always more. There's always more we get to learn about ourselves when situations like grief and trauma and pandemics happen, where our lives are kind of turned upside down.
Mm. Now, you specifically mentioned the nervous system earlier. Let's talk a little bit about the impact of our emotional state on our nervous system and why it's so important. to turn and face the things that we're feeling, because it's not just emotional, right? We're talking about we're mind, body, and spirit. So they're all three involved in the trauma together. So let's talk about that piece.
So yeah, it's a fascinating question, because I've been researching it a lot for my book that's coming out in July, and what we know now about brain development is the right brain develops first, and that's our sensory part. That's the part that I'm talking about, where we feel emotionally safe. So, it's interesting, all the new studies that are coming out. You can't hold a baby too much. You can't spoil a baby. Don't spank kids. Well, I learned all that, 30 years ago in my early childhood program, and people would argue with it. So now we have brain research to show don't do that, because we know now that this is what human beings need, is to be held. And that's, again, the hard part about this lack of physical contact, is we need to feel physically close. So when an infant is born, they need to be held, they need to be comforted, they need to be fed. They don't come in the world talking like, hey, are you there for me, mom, hey, you're neglecting me. They just feel safe when the caregiver shows up. And then over time, the right brain develops a sense of emotional safety. And that's the piece that I think for many of us got pruned off because of the old ways of doing things. And people get really uncomfortable when I say this, because they think, well, I turned out all right. And it's not about that your parents were bad. It's about that, again, this is brand new, hot off the press, our social emotional development. So why I wrote my book, The Shadow of the Too Good Mother Archetype, is because women kept turning it on themselves, trying to do it different, because I know I'm supposed to do it different, but I keep doing it the same. And so that's when I realized it's in the body memory. It's not in the 1, 2, 3s. So eventually, over time, as the left brain develops, that's our logical mind, it starts to make up these stories around safety. And so we tend to make up different stories. Everybody's different. So we either move away from people because we don't feel safe. That's isolation avoidance. Or we either move towards them by people pleasing and overgiving and perfectionism. Or we move against, and that's the people who get angry and just fight and get defensive. And so these are the three main ways that we deal with our social emotional safety and the way it got set up in the neurobiology. And so then what happens is the vagus nerve, which is the largest cranial nerve from the brainstem down into the body, is evolving into what Stephen Porges talks about, the social engagement system. And so because it used to be fight or flight, run from the tiger, and now it's really about this emotional safety. So the nervous system has a similar response, that I am being chased by a tiger when I don't feel emotionally safe. So say if I'm bullied in school, we're talking about why there's so much suicide and depression in adolescence. And I think it's because kids aren't feeling emotionally safe. And then, the bully triggers this idea that it goes back to the fact that I'm not lovable. That's the story that we make up. So I know that was a long answer to your question, but it's fascinating to me to think about, when we have a nervous system response, which is a trauma, which is what we're all in right now with this pandemic, that it just triggers this idea of, well, what's my story? Am I going to hide and avoid? Am I going to people please? Am I going to argue and defend and just get mad and angry? And everybody is acting out. You can see it. If you look at the different things that people are doing in response to what's going on, you can see the different, oh, well, that person's avoiding, that person's people pleasing, that person is mad and raging. And our frontal lobe goes offline, basically, is what happens. And so we need to get the frontal lobe back online. And I suggest doing something like present moment practice, like find 5 things that are going on right now that are safe, so you can get back into present moment time. Because really the truth is, whatever's going on externally, if we look at the present moment, we're usually safe. We're usually sitting in a comfortable chair, or we're eating a meal, or we might be listening to the birds, or something safe is happening in the moment, but the body doesn't know that because the frontal lobe's offline. So we want to get the frontal lobe back online, come back into present moment. And like I said, that's a big question, but that's kind of my summary. I hope I answered it for you.
Well, first, I apologize for such a big question. I'm a big thinker, so sometimes I am not specific enough, but I do love several things that you said. You handled that beautifully, Patty. Thank you so much. But you said a couple of things that really, three things that stand out to me, and I'm just going to list them really quickly.
Okay.
Talking about being held. I want to make a comment on that. Physical touch is a huge part of feeling safe, loved, secure. And I have noticed, because we're all in our house together, that during the height of the anxiety and the world around us, like you said, the way this ties into the three ways people react, I was trying to remember to touch my family members, rub their shoulders, give them a hug, making sure, because I noticed that that does lower the anxiety. It really does. And we don't realize we need it. We're so busy hustling to survive emotionally or mentally or whatever. You mentioned the three ways, which was the withdraw, isolate, people please, overcompensate, and the defensive, resistant person. And it's so true. That adds into this emotional journey of going out into a world where you're getting so many different, I say I'm bumping up against other people's stories.
Oh, definitely. Yep.
There's a lot of judgment and criticism, and people, it's like intensified. The frontal lobe, that was the third thing, how the frontal lobe goes offline. You can totally see it. If you've learned that, you and I have learned that, the truth. You go out into the world and you go, aha. It's still irritating, but it gives you a certain empathy. But imagine, people don't realize they're all busy surviving and nobody's walking in that empathy. Or I shouldn't say nobody. That's a pretty strong statement. But it does seem that a very large number of people are not walking in the empathy. They're walking in those three things, whatever they are. And man, it creates another level of emotional chaos that's going around us. And so let's talk about that, navigating that emotional chaos. How does someone, because that touch, I wanted to tell you one story on that. My niece did she's 5. She did a little video for her teacher. And the snippet was, I don't like air hugs. I want a real hug. I hate quarantine.
Oh.
She's the sweetest thing. She's like, she's saying, I don't like not being able to touch my teacher, my friends, my whatever. And they instinctively know at 5, don't touch this, don't touch that. And it is somewhat necessary in certain situations, but it's also how we need to compensate in another way to make sure we're not traumatizing ourselves. Right? So let's talk about that's going on right now.
Absolutely. And I know I toss that around all the time in terms of how to do that. And out of the mouths of babes, children are divine teachers, I believe. And I don't like air hugs. Who does? I mean, we need physical touch. I live by myself with my cat. Thank God I have my cat, because I can get a little bit of snuggles that way. But my friends, when I'm now socially distancing, visiting them, we do that. We're air hug, and it's hard. It's really hard. So I don't have an answer for that. And I think that we're going to see how the biology adapts. I think we're all really adaptive. But the scary part for me is I would prefer to evolve more into this social engagement, feeling emotionally safe place, as opposed to creating more trauma, which that's my concern. I think we're creating, especially, and I'm just going to talk about the immigrant kids in the cages. I mean, that just breaks my heart every day. We're talking about these kids, and how many people are being affected in terms of their emotional development and how that's going to affect other people. And so, there's so many layers of that question. I don't have the answer because, again, it's, we're all trying to be safe from this virus, this invisible monster. But there's also another invisible monster, which is our mental health that, hasn't really been addressed through the years well. And I think it's going to trigger a lot of mental health crises.
Yeah.
So how do we give people hugs? How do we do that? I saw a thing on Facebook. There was a nursing home somewhere and they created these plastic, shields to hug people. Did you see that?
No, I've
Yeah.
seen people in plastic bags hug people though, which
Okay.
which I was like, oh, that's really clever. It was like grandparents visiting their grandkids, and they decided that they wanted to see them, so they literally wore like a full blown plastic bag. But the thought that crosses my mind right now is it is creating a lot of invisible walls. The
Hmm.
fear. The
Yeah.
fear is becoming the next monster
Hmm.
that's actually causing more trauma and more difficulty than there needs to be,
Yeah.
from my perspective.
Yeah.
It's one of those like, oh man, I'm an intuitive person, so I think I feel what's happening around, and I just feel like fear is such a
Mhm.
constant companion.
Yeah.
And that's another layer of grief, isn't it?
Hmm.
Not being able to go somewhere without being afraid. And you grieve that feeling of, I just want to go to the coffee shop, or I
Yeah.
just want to go to the grocery store.
Yeah.
We're constantly navigating emotionally.
Yeah.
And I think grief alone, let's step out of the pandemic, let's step out of what's happening in the world, and just grief alone,
Hmm.
right? By
Hmm.
itself in a normal, quote, life.
Hmm.
We're constantly dancing with what's happening in our bodies, in our hearts, and in our minds. And what are some tools that we can use, Patty? How can we not just have the discussion that it's real, it's happening, because we've had that discussion and we're inundated with that discussion? Can we kind of bring some hope to the conversation?
Yeah, and that's why the course that I'm creating, I called Transforming Grief and Fear into Love and Grace for that very reason, because the fear and the grief, they're good friends. They kind of exist together. A friend of mine, we were talking about that when we were having a conversation at the beginning of all this. It's like it feels very similar. And so what happens in grief, very much like fear, is what I was talking about earlier, is that frontal lobe goes offline, the primitive brain takes over, and we don't feel safe in the world. And so what we really want to do is come back to present moment safety. And I think the most important thing, the biggest gift, is if there are people who are willing to listen to us tell our stories. Because they say in grief, we have to tell the story at least 100 times. And it takes a really strong person to be willing to listen to those stories, because my experience has been, and I know a lot of other people have said, you try and tell somebody the story and the person listening says, oh, I don't want to make you uncomfortable talking about this. I don't want to remind you. And so, like we're going to forget, so to get through that old idea that, the way to deal with feelings is to not feel, because Carl Jung says what we resist persists and often grows stronger. So we want to find people who can listen, support groups, friends, coaches, therapists, spiritual mentors, people to sit with us while we tell our stories. And that's how we move it out of the body. That's why I wrote my memoir, right? And so we really need, in order to move through the grief, we have to come back to working with the neurobiology that says I'm safe. Because isn't it the fear of, oh my gosh, this person, especially, I was with my partner for 2 years, and, it was an incredibly wonderful relationship. And, these people have been married 50, 60, 70 years. The sweet stories of how they die, a few days or a few weeks or months later, because they've just been partnered together forever. So it's this feeling of I'm alone. And so one of the messages I got in a meditation when doing my unresolved grief work was sitting with my father and him telling me, you're never ever alone. And then I kind of had a similar experience in meditation after my partner died, saying you're never ever alone. And that is a chapter in my book. And I think it's hard for us to get that we're never ever alone when somebody we love dearly is gone. Our everything is gone, and who is it in the world? And I think, as a single person myself, it is challenging to wrap my head around I'm never alone, when sometimes I feel very alone. But then I realize, I have everything I need, and there are people who care about me, and I got what I need, So the idea that we're never alone, to have an enlightened witness that we can tell the story to to come back into present moment safety and do those present moment, either breathing and mindfulness.
Breathing. Oh my gosh. Breathing, to interject, has been a really useful tool for me in dealing with the frustration and different emotions that have come up, and encouraging my family to breathe, because it slows down our body and our brain, and it actually helps us access that, what you're talking about, right? The breathing actually puts us in a place where we can think clearer. It puts the frontal lobe back online, so we're not so reactive. Isn't that right?
Right, because we take shallow breaths in trauma because the body needs to reserve as much as it can in the old reptilian run away, save myself brain. And so we take shallower breaths because all the other functions in the body are trying to work overtime. So we don't realize that sometimes when we're in grief because we just don't think about it. So yes, to take a deep breath, that's the first thing. And Stephen Porges, polyvagal theory that I was talking about earlier, is even suggesting to extend the exhale a second or two because that actually helps to calm the vagus nerve. It's amazing. Breathing.
I use that when I'm winding down at night to go to sleep. I use an app that helps me just to shut my mind off because I'm a thinker. And so I used to read, which is great depending on what you're reading, but the breathing, one of the exercises always works and they guide me so I don't have to remember. I just do what they say. You breathe in for 4, hold it at the top for 4, and breathe out for 6. Man alive, that's like the best way to just feel your body physically just kind of melts.
Yep.
So good.
Those apps are great. I don't know what app you're using, but I suggest those a lot is because it helps us, it gives us a guide. And there's all kinds of mindfulness apps out there, but that's a great breathing exercise. And to have somebody tell us, to be able to listen to someone guiding us through that is even better. So
there's something about having a resource, right? I think, don't we have a tendency to feel that we have to do it, right? I have to come up with solutions. I'm a solutions woman. People always say, men are such solution finders. I'm like, I am the one who's constantly, when someone's talking to me, reminding myself, don't give them a solution, just hold a space for them. So I feel like we're tending toward independence in a negative way sometimes. And you talked about you're never alone because there are people and there are resources. So let's talk a little bit about great resources. To answer your question, indirect question, I use Headspace because I like his voice. You can choose male or female, but it is a great resource that it has meditations, it has sleep casts. And I have found if I'm resisting stopping, I'm spinning in an emotion. And it's really that mindful practice that you talked about is really the only solution to get me back online.
Yep. Yeah. And it's hard for a lot of people sometimes too, because the nervous system is in the trauma response. And if the story is move into action, do something, and you try and say, well, calm the mind, it's like, what? Are you kidding me? I can't calm my mind right now, And so to have an app, I like, my, earlier years of my practices was Shakti Gawan's creative visualizations and John Kabat-Zinn and, a lot of the meditation teachers, that would, I used to walk with my little Walkman, back in the day. That's how old I am, with the cassette player and the headset, and just listen to these things over and over, guided imageries. So it would quiet my mind. So somebody would say, we're going to breathe and we're going to relax your feet and your toes and everybody's all relaxed. And then we're going to take a walk in the woods and then we're going to meet a guide. And so I actually have those on my website. I've been doing them for my clients for the first 50 days of the pandemic. Every morning I'd get up and I would record a visualization. So I'm getting them up on my website now because I think that to me is helpful, and to a lot of people who can't meditate, to have a guide, because then your mind starts going into the visualization, the imagination story. But at the same time, what your body is doing is reacting calm and being calm. So it kind of tricks the body into feeling calm by giving it a different story, because we know now that imagination is just as strong in the body as what's really happening. So guided imageries are great. Yeah, and Headspace is great. A lot of my clients use that. So anything that can guide you, and you know, because a lot of people say, I can't meditate, you know, I can't quiet my mind. Well, who can really quiet their mind? I mean, it takes a really enlightened Zen master with years and years and years and years and years of study, and people put pressure on themselves like, I can't do that, you know. So that's why I like, you know, Headspace and these guided imagery kinds of exercises.
It feels counterintuitive to slow down, I think, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm. It does. We're in a do. I heard somebody say once we're human doings instead of human beings. Thomas Merton said that, you know, this is contemporary violence when we're, you know, what we do when we overdo and over giving and overdoing and trying to always, you know, do things and get things done. It's really a contemporary form of violence. You know, it's not good to ourselves. It's not what our body needs. Our body needs to rest. And a lot of us are being put in that place right now where we have to slow down.
Yeah. When we talk about moving through the grief, right? How do you help someone give themselves permission and not be afraid to hold a space for that and to feel those feelings? Because I have heard people say, I'm afraid of being overwhelmed and not being able to come out of the sadness.
Yeah. Oh, that's so true. And that's it right there. People are afraid they're going to drown in the sorrow. They're so afraid if they feel it, they'll never get out. And so that's a helpful thing to say, is it's not always going to feel this way. And, you know, we have to go through it. We can't go around it. And tears, I love tears. And if we go back to, again, the old beliefs of stop crying before I give you something to cry about, don't be angry, don't be sad, don't be this, don't be that. That's, you know, we just learned not even 100 years ago that was not a good way to develop our emotional self. So we're undoing a lot of that. And I have clients, you know, who try and hold back tears. And I always say, you know, I love tears. You know, tears are like giving your heart a shower. Tears are so healing. They release toxins. That's why we get teary-eyed. And it, you know, what breaks my heart is these old beliefs that tried to talk us out of what is just part of the human condition. So yeah, to cry, to feel, and to know that it's not always going to be that way. Deepak Chopra says, you know, the shadow is, people think it's the opposite of love when actually it's the way to love, you know. And I think what happens is what goes into the shadow, which is what Carl Jung called the parts of the unconscious that we don't want to look at because we're afraid that they're bad. So when our grief goes into the shadow, it keeps us really stuck. Mm-hmm. And so to recognize that, you know, joy and sorrow, there's a great poem, Kahlil Gibran's poem, Joy and Sorrow. You know, people say which is greater. I say neither. They're two sides of one coin. They're what brings us into balance. Rumi's poem, The Guest House, you know, welcome every emotion that comes to you. It might be clearing you away for some other emotion. So those are the things that I remind my clients. And, you know, it's important to have that enlightened witness, that coach, that spiritual guide, the therapist, the support group, you know, places where you feel it's safe to fall apart and people hold you and you realize that, hold you physically, we're talking about physical, they emotionally hold you and ideally physically, you know, hold you, you know, and then we start to see that deepens us and gets us through to the other side. But that's a beautiful question, because that's, I think, the people's biggest fear, because it's just so brand new. We've never really been given permission to feel our feelings. We've been talked out of them for thousands of years, really, if you go back historically and you look at the way we've lived.
It's interesting you talked about the shadow. Part of that is the stories. Like you said, we start developing stories as soon as our left brain starts kicking in, right? And so shadow in any movie, in any book, is always scary, right? So we are trained and instinctually avoidant of anything that feels shadowy or dark. But I wanted to kind of talk about shadow real briefly and just say, you know what? It only feels like a shadow because it's unknown. It's not danger the way shadow in a movie or a book is, you know? So I feel like it's misrepresenting. It's how we see it in our emotional story. but it's really each step light comes with it. I don't know how else to explain that.
Well, it's the hero's journey. So if you talk about Joseph Campbell's work with mythology, or if you look at fairy tales and how in the oral tradition fairy tales were carried, generation to generation, there's always the dark woods or the witch, or there's always something that we encounter. And I think today, unfortunately, our media, our TV has over sensationalized all that, and it kind of almost desensitized us to the expression of the hero's journey. So like George Lucas, consulted with Joseph Campbell when he wrote Star Wars, because he really wanted to be sure that he represented the hero's journey. And what we have to go through in a hero's journey is listening to our intuitive call, finding the mentors, going into the dark cave. And that's the part that we're afraid to go into. And that's where grief shows up. We go into that dark cave of the unknown. We don't want to go there. We want to exit stage left. Let's get out of here. But if we're willing to stay and to be, and that's what I'm saying, even myself now in this quarantine-ish kind of experience where I've had to be still, I'm even learning more about myself. And then we find that authentic self, or we get a glimmer of our calling and our life's purpose. It's kind of an overused word, life's purpose, but we understand our true self better, our authentic self. And then we, are able to come back into the ordinary world again. And most people in the ordinary world don't really care or get about our experience. So it's when we really recognize that it's not about what anybody else thinks. It's about me living what is my authentic truth. And that's hard work for all of us. So when you said I don't want to say all earlier, I would say, very seldom would I say all, but I think it's just part of the human condition that we all get to choose. And if we don't want to face the shadow and go through that grief work and be in the cave, that's okay too. It's a choice. I feel like for me, I've learned and grown, and it's brought me more fully into life. So I highly recommend it, but it is one that people would not like to enter oftentimes.
My life experience has taught me that the people who avoid it, and in the times when I've put it off, I eventually will turn to face it, is the shadow gets scarier in my mind and this big story builds. And then when I finally leap into the darkness, it's not as dark as I thought it was. It can be dark, but it doesn't usually last as long, or it's not what I thought it was. And so the only way to know the truth is to face it. And I think what the story we're telling ourselves and the truth that's actually in the shadow are very rarely the same thing.
Right. Yeah, I can give you an example of a client I'm working with right now. She's a PhD biology student, so she's very left-brained. And her mother died when she was 16. She's in her early 30s now, late 20s, early 30s. And her story is, people don't like me. I'm not going to get this good enough. My advisor's not going to be happy with my work. No one really likes me. That's her story. And it's over and over and over and over. And I keep telling her about my experience of unresolved grief and how it might be helpful for her to write her mom a letter, because her mom was also a very punitive, punishing, strict mother who was always giving her those messages that she wasn't good enough. So then when she dies at 16, of course, my client at 16 thought it was her fault, because she didn't do enough. She wasn't the good enough daughter that her mother needed. But because there's all this unresolved grief, she doesn't want to go into the grief work, and she stays stuck in the story. And so, it's a slow process. People get to choose. And she just is real hesitant to write that letter to mom. Let's tell mom how you really felt about some of the things she said to you when you were little. Let's be angry at mom. It's okay to be angry at mom that she died. It's okay to be angry at mom, because we idealize people after they die, and we want to put them up on this pedestal, and we don't want to feel our feelings because it's
disrespectful.
It's disrespectful, and it reinforces all those old beliefs, that our feelings are bad and we don't have permission to, and and so then we turn it on ourselves. That's what she does. She turns it on herself. Other people could be lashing out or doing, like I said, the other things that we do. but she tends to avoid and isolate and turn it inward. And it's interesting to watch, and we'll see. We'll see. How much she's willing to step into, but it requires a lot of courage.
Yeah. It's interesting is you're sharing that story. One of my clients right now, I encouraged her to do the same thing. Now, mind you, my client is in her 80s, and I said, this topic keeps coming up. It's bubbling to the surface, and it's coming up more and more often. You keep saying this thing about your mother. Now, her mother's been gone for years, obviously. And I said, I think you need to write a letter to her. And she said immediately, I don't want to do it. She wanted to do it, really. But she said her instinct was, I don't want to do it. And so I said to her, often the thing that we're resisting the most is where the pathway through is. And so she started it. And it started out as a narrative. And I said, that's fine. I said, but here's the thing I'd like to share and get your input on. One of the things that I teach is someone doesn't have to be bad in order for us to be good. It's separating that enmeshment. We don't have to vilify someone to be okay. Getting to the space where it's like they made their choices. I may be grieving the impact of those choices, and I do need to feel the anger. All of that is fine to feel. I just don't want to live there. So when I recognize that I'm a separate person, I get to make separate choices. I can feel separate. I can tell separate stories. It's all okay. And to honor the fact that that hurt, that sucked, I hated it, does not mean you're bad, you suck, I hate you. And I think that's maybe part of the grieving journey is it gets tangled in there. But at some point, I feel like if we just throw it all against the wall, maybe you can give me your input on this. Just write it all down, get it out of your head. Don't judge it. Just let it come out. It's like a boiling something. When the bubbles settle, a lot of that power dissipates. The negative power dissipates. At least that's what I have found in my work for myself and what I've helped other people with. What's your perspective on that in terms of doing grief work and allowing that to just be what it is without having to attach it to someone else?
Well, when you said boiling, you're talking about turning up the heat. And I think that's in fire is where is the transformation. We're talking about transforming the grief into love and grace. So, it's really turning up the heat and allowing it to be what it is that transforms. Fire is the only element of the 4 elements that will completely change you. If you put your hand in water, you're just going to feel the water. You put your hand in the air, it's the air. You put your hand in the dirt, you're going to get dirty. You put your hand in fire, and that hand will never be the same. So fire is an important element in terms of working with grief and allowing ourselves to feel the heat of the grief. And that's where the transformation happens. I mean, the image of the phoenix rising from the ashes, right? Something else gets to be born when we allow our grief to be what it is.
You know how you know something, but it can still be scary even if you've done some of the work? How do we encourage people to deal with that piece? What hopeful thought can you kind of give to that story of fear of the shadow?
Right. And that's a good question, because I think that's what keeps people from doing the work is because of the fear. So back to the fear and grief, that it isn't as scary as you think. I love the movie, The Never Ending Story. Do you remember that movie? And he was in search of the nothing. They're in search of the nothing, and it's nothing. It really isn't what we make it up to be. And it gets made up because of these old stories of don't feel. And I always like to say to people, another thing this graduate professor said to me, I think I learned everything in that one course. I could have saved a lot of student loan money if I had just taken what she taught me in that one class, is all feelings are okay, but all behavior isn't. And to really learn that our feelings, what you said earlier about it's not good or bad. We want to box things off into right, wrong, good, bad, this, that. We want to black or white. And really, it's a paradox. It's really learning how to embrace paradox and recognize that I can be angry at my mother for dying. I can be resentful that my kids take up all my time. I can feel what I feel, but I don't have to act on it. I don't have to hurt myself or anybody else because of that feeling. And that to me is the key part here, is that all feelings are okay. And where's the safe container? You need a container for it, because it's like Medusa if you let all your feelings out at once, which is why I tell people therapy takes a long time. You know, we don't expect to come into a therapy or a coaching session and get it all figured out in 3 sessions or less. And that's what people want, because that's what we're used to. It's really an ongoing process of having that person in your life that's a guide, a witness, whether it's your coach or your therapist or your spiritual advisor, your support group, your best friend, whatever, to hold you and help contain that, as well as finding your ways to self-soothe and self-source. I think art, if you like art, is creative arts. You know, I've gotten so many people back into doing art because they felt that they weren't good enough. And then it becomes, oh, well, this really feels good, because it shuts off. It calms the nervous system because it gets you out of that monkey mind brain. So finding an outlet to express your grief, writing about it, drawing about it, dancing about it, singing about it, helps to move the energy. Having that enlightened witness in your life that can listen to you, and knowing that you can only do little bits at a time, and that grief is going to come in waves. You know, my partner has been gone 3.5 years now, and I obviously am the expert on grief. You know, so when he died, I was like, I'm going to get this right this time. I know how to do it. And it really brought up a lot of those feelings of, how do I do it? Who's there for me? And I knew, the one thing I knew in response to that question is, I knew that the only way to get to the other side is to go through it. That was the lesson that I learned from my 40 years of having to work with grief. So I was determined to allow myself to feel what I was feeling, and to find people I could talk to, and to write the book. So anyway, I really felt like I did some really good grief work. And then now in this pandemic, of course, you know, I'm back in some grief, because man, it'd be nice to have him here right now, right? So also to be willing to know that that's going to happen. A woman I interviewed, Hope Edelman, wrote a book that's coming out called After Grief. She lost her mother when she was a child too. And I loved the conversation I had with her a while back about how, you know, we don't really honor that later in our lives, you know, and when we get married, or when we have children, or when we go through big events, like publishing a book, you know, boy, you know, you miss the people who really loved you, you know, when things like that in your life are happening. And so you're back in grief. I had a client yesterday, his sister died. He's such a sweet man. He's definitely your people pleaser, moving towards kind of reaction. He likes to take care of everybody. And it's so sweet to see it in a man, you know, because I don't want to be gender specific, but, you know, it tends to be the women are the codependent overgivers. So I'm working with this highly sensitive, sweet man who's married with, you know, a baby and another one on the way, trying to help his mother and his father and his wife's family get through grief and everything, or get through situations in life. So he took a breath yesterday and he said, yeah, this forever grief. And I went, can I use that? I'm going to use that. Forever grief. You know, it's forever grief, but it doesn't have to be painful forever. And so I was thinking, you know, the title could be Forever Grief, Infinite Grace. So again, transforming the grief and fear into love and grace is something that my partner, who passed away, had lost his wife of 20 years, and he was writing a curriculum called From Fear to Love to Grace. So for him, he was having this profound experience of his heart opening, kind of like, you know, we talk spiritually, I think it's a Sufi thing of break my heart open to a higher love. So there's this idea that when our human hearts are broken open, it actually opens us up to a different, deeper experience of love. And he said what he felt that was grace. And so I did some interviews when I was launching the book, Letters to Freedom, From Fear to Love to Grace, and I asked people to define grace, you know, and people's experiences of grace. And everybody has a different, I mean, language is a weird thing because, you know, everybody has a meaning. Again, the story that we make up about what it means. But what it means to me is this ability to allow life on life's terms, and to feel a sense of loving that deeply that now you want to love everything and everyone, you know, because you know that you can love that much and the pain that you feel of losing someone you love that much, you can either keep it in, and you can hoard and you can get angry and you can have all kinds of feelings which you need to move through to get to the grace. But the feeling of all there is love on the other side. That's all we got. So how do we step into that with grace and ease and know that the more love we bring to ourselves and to others is really the most important thing. And I don't think we can get there without feeling the grief fully. Well, I can't say sure we can. We can always skim the surface, but to really feel into that sense of love and grace.
The fullness of it, right? The fullness of it.
Right.
Well, I can't believe it. We've already talked for almost an hour. I'm just blown away. And I'm so grateful that you took what you've learned and what you've felt and how you've hurt, and you've shaped it into something so beautiful, and you're sharing it. This is the kind of thing that changes the world. This is the kind of thing. And I want to honor you for taking that journey, for picking up the mantle, running at it, and doing it scared. So I just really honor you, Patti. What a gift today has been.
Do I have time to read this 4-line quote that Lawrence wrote in his book? Because he was I told you we were having technical difficulties getting signed on, and I kept hearing him say this in my head. So I think back to the grace part is I feel like he's always with me in spirit. So he wants me to read this. And this is what he wrote in his curriculum, From Fear to Love to Grace. You are an expression of love before you were born. You will return into love when you pass. Between your first and last breath, your true mission is to remember the love that you are and to extend this love to all those around you. Lawrence Freedom.
That's beautiful.
Yeah, so it's interesting. Someone I was listening to last night talk about first and last breath, and I can't remember who it was. That's really the cycle of life, is we take our first breath when we're born and our last breath. So I had forgotten that he had written that. So
that's pretty powerful. I call it a God wink, right? Just that reminder. Yeah. So if someone was sitting in front of you and they were just really facing this journey, however that grief came to them, the loss of someone, the loss of something, what 3 things would you gift them to help them in their journey?
Well, that you're never alone, you are enough, and never give up on love.
And love comes in many forms, and just like grief and all of that, right? It's something that changes. So in our lives, in our seasons, it may show up a little differently. We just get better at recognizing it, I think. Yeah. Hopefully.
Well, because it's a misunderstood word, right? Talk about semantics. Oftentimes it's well, if you love me, you'll do this for me. It's not about that. It's completely letting go and unconditional positive regard. Misunderstood, but important.
Yes. Well, Patti, again, I want to thank you. Thank you so much for powering through the delays, my brain being off kilter in a day, and then the technology. I really just am so grateful that we powered through and spent this time together.
Me too. It was wonderful to talk with you and be with you. So thank you so much.
My pleasure. And as always, it's just so timely. I love when, things just work the way they work, and you can sit back and just revel in the beauty of timing and the way God works. So today I've been talking with Patti-Ashley. She's a psychotherapist, an authenticity architect, and the author of Letters to Freedom, From Fear to Love to Grace. If you head over to www.feminineroadmap.com/episode 177, I will have all the links you need to connect with Patti. If you're interested in her book, if you're interested in her services, or you just want to go to her website and tap into the resources that she has there, please check that out. And while you're there, please leave your name and email address and become a part of my tribe. I send out periodic emails of encouragement. Today, we've talked about something that touches every single life. No one gets to live life without being touched by some form of grief. And I hope that you've received the message that Patti brought today. And that is, we don't need to be afraid to go through the journey of grief. because the gift on the other side, the fire that we are afraid of, is actually the gift that's going to give us the greater levels of love and grace in our lives. So remember, you're never alone. You are enough, and never give up on love. Thank you so much for joining us today. Please share this episode. Shout it out on your social media. Get this hope out into the world. Take action to share the things that are going to make our world a better place. Thank you so much for joining us today. We look forward to sharing more inspiration and resources with you in the future. Take care, my friends. Bye-bye.